as a writer, your aim is to create drama, not to resolve it.
Right.
The moment you resolve things, then there is no drama, and you want to create drama. The question is, can you do it with subtlety? Can you do it in a way that doesn't feel ham-handed? And I think that depends on the quality of the writer.
Lounging, son. All right, cool. Welcome back to the Comic Lounge. My name's Ryan, and today I have a really awesome guest with me. I have Ram V.
Hello.
Right. It seems like you're writing like every other book I see on the shelf now. I mean, you're an absolute machine. You did Blue and Green last year, which has been on a lot of lists. It's on my to-read pile. I haven't been able to get a copy yet. And then all the DC stuff you're doing, all of it phenomenal. So thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So what I like to do with everybody the first time, especially if it's like the first time I'm chatting with them, I always like to ask what their first exposure was to comic books and what really started their love for comics.
Sure. My first exposure to comics was just reading them as a kid, really, in India. We didn't get a lot of Marvel DC stuff. The only time I'd look at sort of mainstream American comics were when relatives would travel to Europe or to America, and they'd bring back these things called digests that just had like multiple stories in no particular reading order from different, I don't know why, but that's what I used to read. Most of my reading was European comics, so I would read a lot of Mandrake and Phantom, Flash Gordon, Tintin, Asterix. So those are the comics that I grew up on. And then for the longest time, I stopped reading comics because I remember this very vividly. My dad walked into my room one day, picked up all my comics, threw them into trash bags, and said, "You have to read. You have to read proper books now." And he basically gave away my comics, and I stopped reading them for the longest time. And then I'd moved to the U.S. to study chemical engineering when I was 19, 20. I was living in Philly at the time, and a friend of mine gifted me the first volume of Sandman for my birthday, and it was the first time I'd read a comic after having read all of those things as a kid, and it really kind of blew my mind as to sort of just mentally making that jump from what I'd read as a kid to, oh wait, you can do this with comics.
Right.
And I think that was the first time that I really kind of got back into them. And I'd always been writing as a kid, so my hobby was always had always been around, if you will. And I think first time I started seriously considered writing was around the age of 22, 23. Kind of started publishing stuff here and there, and then one thing led to the other. I quit chemical engineering in 2013 or so, and I just started writing professionally. And yeah, so comics were one of the first things someone suggested I should do, and I was like, yeah, I know how to write a comic. I totally didn't, but yeah.
Chemical engineering, man, that is very different than writing comic books. When did you like? I mean, so were you writing while you were still doing chemical engineering, or
yeah, yeah. I was writing. I'd been writing since I was like 13 or so, and most of it's stuff that didn't get published. But I think somewhere around 2021, I wrote a collection of poems that got published somewhere. And then while I was working as a chemical engineer, I would write short stories. I think 4 or 5 of them got published on online markets and short story websites and all of that. So I always knew that there was some measure of talent there that I had developed just off of writing being a hobby. And then once I had a couple of larger things like 8,000-9,000 word short stories published, it really started eating into me. Like, I really just want to do that. I don't want to do chemical engineering. And then 2013, I decided, yeah, okay, I had enough. I quit, dove in both feet. For the first year or so, I had no paying work, which was but I'd worked as a chemical engineer at that point for about 6 or 7 years.
Right.
So I was living off of savings, but it was getting to a point where I was like, I really need to make some money off of this.
Yeah.
I started ghostwriting autobiographies. I wrote comics in India, and so money was trickling in. It was all right. And then I think 2016, I self-published a book called Black Mumba, which was crime noir stories set in Mumbai, and put that on Kickstarter, and we raised like £13,000 to make the book, and that was the first time I went, okay, I can do something with this.
I'm curious because I haven't heard of that book. Is that available anywhere for anybody watching or listening, or was that only?
It is available through an affiliated website, and I've got boxes of it sitting that I'm supposed to send out to comic book stores in the States. But given how frazzled I am, I just haven't gotten around to it. But I will. And
Okay,
once
yeah,
they're
I
out
definitely.
there, yeah.
Crime noir is probably my favorite genre. I mean, I love Brubaker and Phillips and stuff like that. So I definitely want to get a copy. So make sure you make those available, man. I would definitely want to check them out.
Yeah, it's definitely available on my website.
Okay.
It's called iforlondonprints.com, and you can check it out. Black Mumba graphic novel available there.
Awesome.
So yeah, individual copies. I'll usually do a little sketch in them and sign them before I send them out. So
Oh, cool, dude. That's awesome. So, like you kind of talked about already, like I was going to ask you what made you decide to do the jump from, fan to creative. I was wondering who were some of the writers, since you said you've been writing for such a long time from such a young age, who were some of the writers that really kind of inspired you or that you kind of admired as a kid?
originally a lot of my reading came outside of comics when I started, because I didn't really, even though I was writing, I wasn't really writing comics at the time. So
Right.
um, a lot of the writers I was reading were fantasy writers. I was reading Joe Abercrombie. I'd read J.R.R. Tolkien. I'd read Stanislav Lem, who did Solaris. Dune, Frank Herbert, Ursula Le Guin. So I had a wide sort of array of writers that I'd read. Um, it wasn't really until I moved to the UK and started studying creative writing that I started studying writers, if you will.
Hmm.
And so there was a marked shift in the way I looked at writing after that. And since then, probably writers like Paul Auster, Michael Chabon um, have been bigger influences on my writing style. Um, in terms of comics, very predictable. I read Sandman. I read everything Neil Gaiman had done, and then I read somewhere on an article that Alan Moore had recommended him to Karen Berger when they first started working at Vertigo. So I said, okay, I wonder who Alan Moore is. So I read everything Alan Moore had done. Then it kind of followed that I would read, Morrison,
Right.
Ellis, Ennis, all of that sort of Vertigo lineage, if you will. And so that was really the kind of comic that built my interest in comics. I only retroactively started reading the more sort of heroes mainstream stuff
Hmm.
um, once I discovered them through reading Vertigo.
I just have to say I'm so happy you mentioned Vertigo because I absolutely love Vertigo comics. It for me as well. Like I grew up reading superhero stuff first, so Sandman wasn't the one that like for you. You said it was Sandman. For me, I think the first, even though it wasn't technically Vertigo, was Saga of the Swamp Thing by
Mhm.
Warren Bissett and Toddleben. And when I read that, I think I was like probably 12, and I'm like, what the fuck is this? This is so and everything else I'm reading. And I think that's when the switch flipped in me, and then I started picking up books like it's and then I just started my love of Vertigo. Karen Berger and Shelley Bond were the two editors
Yeah.
that I noticed at first, because then I started paying attention. I'm like, I want to know everything that goes into making a comic book, and I think that Vertigo will always be my favorite imprint of any comic book company. I think it's like Fables, 100 Bullets, Scalped, Why the Last Night. I mean, you could just go on and on. Like that came from that. And which leads me into what I want to talk to you about next, which is your Swamp Thing. After I read the first issue, my buddy Dylan and I we're doing on our YouTube channel. We're going through each week and we're breaking down the future state books and what we like, what we don't like. And we both said it's so clear that he loves Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. Like you can see it in the book. And what I loved the most about your Swamp Thing, the future state, is that the thing that not everybody gets, I think, when they write Swamp Thing necessarily, is that search for humanity. And I mean, maybe this is me projecting, but I felt like Alec looking for humanity in this like almost post-apocalyptic world is almost like a mirror for him searching for the humanity within himself. Now, I don't know if that's just in my mind and that's just what I perceived from it, but I kind of projected that onto it. I think it's phenomenal. What you're doing with that, and it's getting me so hyped for the next issue. I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate on what your goal is with this, because I do know that the next series is a new Swamp Thing.
Yeah. So you're presuming it's Alec. We'll see about that.
Okay, all right.
But I think, without going into the specifics of story, I agree with you that there is something there about the search for humanity, right? And a lot of what Alan Moore did was internalize that, where there was this thing that wasn't entirely human, that wasn't human really, because he buries Alec Holland's bones at one point.
Right.
And it was still a lens of an inhuman thing trying to find its humanity once again, because it is the echo of something that used to be human, right?
Right.
But he internalized that, and he made that part of the character. And I suppose I do love a lot of what Alan Moore did. And when we were originally discussing this series, the greatest pitfall that a lot of new writers face is how do you follow on from someone who did seminal work, right?
Right.
And how do you do that while still using that work as a sort of internal core of what you're wanting to do, without just looking like you're aping what came before you? And I suppose the idea there is to split what Alan Moore did with those comics into the stories that he wrote and his thematic obsessions. And his thematic obsessions were certainly the search for humanity and the understanding your own body, understanding your own drives. How does an inhuman thing look at love? And what I want to do with the series going forward is take all of those thematic explorations and project them outward, in that, okay, if Swamp Thing is this thing that has lived forever, that have been, n number of Swamp Things that have existed through time, and clearly it is a construct that will outlive humanity, then what does it perceive humanity to be? Now, from the perspective of not one person looking for his humanity, but a thing that will outlive us all, looking at us and going, what are you? Why do I love you so much? And so maybe those kinds of things are the thematic preoccupations that I will have in doing the series. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, and that's what I really love too, is because like you said, like when you're following, like, Swamp Thing by Alan Moore is probably the pinnacle, right, of the character to a lot of people. I mean, Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson, obviously you can't ignore what they did with the character.
Sure.
But what I love is that you took what Alan Moore did, you took the past, but you really took it to a different level and gave us something that, like, I didn't even know what to expect with it. And I think that that's why it, like, really resonated with me. And another thing that I thought was really cool, and I wanted to know if it was you and Mike Perkins coming up, you're the artist on the book, coming up with this idea together, or if it was your direction. And that is, Alec is creating these swamp people, right? But he's creating organs that are similar to humans within them, and you break down like the vocal cords and throughout the pages, and we get like the glimpse of what they look like. That was really awesome, and I just wanted to ask if you guys came up, like I said, like if you came up with it together, or was that more your idea?
I mean, that was in the script,
Okay.
and I think it came as part of the original idea because I'm doing something with that. Like I know a lot of people's reaction was like, "This is really cool," but also a lot of people like, "I have no idea why it's here."
Yeah.
And I think when you read issue 2, you'll start understanding why that's there. The idea of someone constructing life,
Yeah.
right? And you don't really have time to think about that when you're reading the comic. But really think about it. What would it be like if you were left alone and you had all these pieces and you could put them together and create other people? Um, Essentially, you've become God, not in terms of power, but in terms of the fact that you're responsible. You've created life now, and I think there is something interesting to be explored there. And so those diagram pages were in the script, and what Mike and I did was to then go in and go like, okay, let's go look at old school retro anatomy textbooks and let's find what pieces will kind of go in and fit in best. So yeah.
Yeah, it was awesome. I mean, at first I was like, "What is like?" I had that reaction. I'm like, "What is this? What's the purpose of this?" But then like you get to the end and like there's got to this has to mean something. And I liked how they called him Father Green. Also,
Mm.
kind of alludes to, like you said, like because he's creating life. So like I'm assuming like they look to him almost as if he's their god, kind of.
Sure.
So I'm very excited for the second issue. But I know that, like I had mentioned, you're going to write a Swamp Thing book. Is it an ongoing or is it a 10-issue series? I see conflicting things on the.
We So the way we discussed it is we said we're going to do 10 issue seasons. So season 1 is going to be 10 issues,
Okay.
and then at the end of that, we'll sit down with editorial. We'll sit down with people who make decisions at DC and go, okay, how did this do?
Mm.
How are we feeling about this? And if it's done well, if the sales are good, if people have picked up the book and they're enjoying it, then we will renew for a season 2, if that makes
Okay.
sense.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Anybody listening, you better buy this book because Swamp Thing's one of my favorite characters. I don't want to see it end after 10 issues. Okay, so before we leave Swamp Thing, this two-part question. One, how much of the future state Swamp Thing story will influence, if at all, your upcoming Swamp Thing? And can you kind of talk about, without ruining anything, about this new Swamp Thing and your decision to create a new Avatar of the Green?
Yeah, so part one of the question is an easy answer. Because future state is set in the future, technically it can't influence anything in the story, in as much as the word influence means that it's going to affect what happens here. Rather than
Okay.
influence, I would say there are things, small things, that you will see here and there in the future state story. And if you keep them in mind as you see the ongoing series unfold in March, you'll go, oh, maybe that's what happened. Oh, maybe that's the guy who showed up there.
Okay.
And so largely though, I've tried to keep it kind of self-contained, if you will, in that I don't want 2 issues that I did for an event to be the great influencing thing on the bigger series going forward either.
Right, right,
So
right.
so it's a matter of balancing those 2 things. And on the decision to make a new Avatar of the Green, frankly, I think that's where the storytelling needed to evolve to. Because I know people love Alec Holland. I love Alec Holland. And I love the history there with Abigail and Tiffy and Arcane and all of that stuff, right? But that is interpersonal drama that you've set up there, and beyond the point, Swamp Thing is a much bigger idea than one person,
Hmm.
and I think the great sort of stumbling block for Swamp Thing stories has been the fact that it always returns to the same bit of interpersonal drama, which is nice. But when you've done it for 40 years, you're like, okay, let's look at something else, right?
Right.
And so part of my motivation was going, okay, well, we'll still take the Swamp Thing concept, but we're going to attach it to someone entirely new who's going to have their own fears, their own emotional baggage, their own drama, their own relationships, and the stories that we tell with the big Swamp Thing idea, going to a different planet, or changing the face of the world, or remembering things that the world remembers but humanity doesn't. All of those things will now reflect against this new canvas, this new character's humanity. And so you're going to tell something that's new. Otherwise, the risk of doing the same character over and over again is that you're just dressing up old stories as new things.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, the third motivation was, frankly, when I grew up in India reading comics, the only Indian characters in comics were mysterious Hindu mystics have showed up and they're doing some magic stuff. And I mean, which is an artifact of its time, but it had great influence in me as a reader because I was incapable of perceiving an Indian person as the protagonist of a story
Right.
because I had never read any stories with an Indian person as a protagonist. And then I started writing and very consciously making stories that talked about where I come from. So These Savage Shores, Graffiti's Wall, all of these are stories set in India, in Mumbai. And so by the time I got to pitching this story, I knew I was at a place where I was like, look, I can do this. I can take an Indian character and use them as a protagonist, as a fully fleshed out character, rather than either making it lip service, going like, oh yeah, fine, he's Indian, there you go, I'm just going to write him like I write every other character, or falling into the side of making it too much about the fact that the character is Indian either. And so I think it's an interesting tool, an interesting thing to add into the canon of what Swamp Thing stories can be.
Yeah, dude. I mean, I love that I love that you kind of went to that place of bringing in a new Avatar of the Green, especially because I feel like it's kind of been, it's a lot of people have been thinking like Poison Ivy would become the new Avatar of the Green. I mean, all over the internet, that's kind of what it seemed like. Alec was kind of going to go away and there'd be a new Avatar. So I'm excited to see this. I feel like you said, it'll add to not where you're not retreading old stories and like repurposing them. Like,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I'm very excited for that. And next, I want to talk about Justice League Dark. You had an awesome run leading up to Future State. Now you have the backups in the Future State Justice League. I loved it. Detective Chimp as as Etrigan. I could not contain the laughter when I first saw that page. Awesome. How did you go? What made you decide to have Detective Chimp be the new wielder of Etrigan? Like this,
well,
and like obviously, like this is in the future, so there had to have been an event that Jason Blood doesn't have him, and now Detective Chimp.
Well, you'll find out in issue 2.
Okay.
As to what happened there, but so I don't want to spoil too many things either. But
okay, yeah.
I'll talk about when this story was just basically I was told, hey, this story is going to happen, and we need a Future State pitch from you really quickly. So I was talking to my editors, and I'd put this idea together, and we were going back and forth with it. And I knew I wanted to shake up the team a little bit because they'd been this same team for what, over 2 years. And so I said, look, I want to shake up the team a little bit. I want to bring in characters that are just plain weird and obscure and haven't been seen in a while. And like, you have all these great characters. You have Etrigan and you have Ragman, and there's interesting ways these can be used. And always the fear is that, oh, we won't, no one will want to read this because those characters aren't, Batman level of popular. Um, and I always feel like that's a question of how you write them as well. Like you can make
Of
them
course.
popular, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew I wanted to use Etrigan. Story came along, and it was a very important story beat between this whole Jason Blood, Etrigan, and why they're not together anymore thing. And so we were just running through a list of like, oh well, who do I attach Etrigan to then? Because I still want to do that. And at one point, like I said, maybe we could do Bobo, and the editors just went, yes, do that.
Yeah.
And I was skeptical in the beginning, and then it's just like, nah, let's just run with it. And so we did that, and it took off. It did well.
Yeah, I mean, it's brilliant in my opinion. I was like, dude, so perfectly in the dynamic between every time he calls on Etrigan, he's like, you just stop, like, don't call on me, and like, so he's like pissed at him for calling on him. And I love the Justice League Dark. I love that you threw in Ragman in there. Yeah. I like the more obscure characters. I think that for me as a fan and a reader, who I would say, like, I've pretty much been a diehard DC. DC was the first, Flash was my first comic book. Like,
right.
I want to see the larger cast of characters that, I mean, DC has such a rich collection of characters that I feel like are so underutilized. So it's so great to hear you say, like, you want to bring back some of these weird, obscure characters that we haven't seen.
Yeah, and I think the way to do that also is, again, not be too beholden to what has gone before.
Right.
I think so. Ragman's also going to be part of the main team going forward in the Justice League Dark one that starts in March. And so I looked at it and I went, there is a thing here which is an opportunity which no one's done so far. And so I think I've changed. Well, not changed. I've kind of explored the way the character works in a very significant way, and I think people get the first glimpse of that in issue 2 of Future State. People have underestimated what Ragman can do. So,
I mean, yeah, he fucking went all out at issue 1. So I've never seen Ragman used in that way. So I thought that was really awesome. So this one obviously feels like your story that's going to take place starting in March will, like, you're kind of planting future seeds, like, and I've noticed this is the way. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like if a writer is writing the character in Future State, there's more of a chance that we'll see some of those threads picked up on or being led to, right, in their ongoing stuff moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, that was the brief that I was given was we want you to tell stories that we could potentially build up to in the main run without making them too sort of rigid. So yeah, and you'll see what I mean again when you read issue 2. But yeah, it absolutely is an extrapolation of the future of where the run begins in March. Yeah.
Awesome. And I wanted to ask too, what was the decision to move to a backup story as opposed to continuing the ongoing?
I think it was just a matter of COVID, right? And
right.
The distribution changes, the shutdowns. There was always going to be the sense that we couldn't just keep doing the same thing we were doing when there wasn't a pandemic and people could walk into shops and browse and buy books. And so I imagine in the future, as things get better, things will change again, and then lineups will expand, but businesses have to change. And so the lineups contracted, and the question really was, do we cancel this? Do we keep it going? What do we do? And I said, look, I have an idea. I have a story that is going to be interesting. And so I don't know if a lot of people realize this, but JLD is the only story that continues in its backups. All the other backups are short stories that are added to the main story, whereas the Justice League book is going to have one running story with Justice League and another running story with Justice League Dark.
Okay, so is it an 8-page story or is it?
No, they're all 10 pagers.
Oh, they're all 10 pages. Okay,
Yeah.
and then so like eventually, like we'll get a collection. Then I would imagine, right? Like they
It's
since yours is an
the
ongoing story.
yes, it's an ongoing story, and I will hear back more on collections. I know that there's some discussion there of that
Okay.
being done. Yeah.
All right, awesome, man. And next up, I wanted to talk about Catwoman, one of my favorite characters at DC. You were writing a pre Future State. You wrote an awesome Future State book. My problem with Catwoman in Future State was yours was. I liked the way you wrote her in the Future State book. Otto Schmidt's one of I love his art, and I can't. I wish he was on more stuff. But I felt like in another Future State story that she was in, it didn't match the characterization. Like it felt really different as opposed to yours, you know. So
Right.
I was wondering, like what about Selena makes her such an interesting character to write? Because she is so like, especially over her history, right? She's so conflicted. Like she's good, she's bad. I mean, like we constantly see it. Like I could point to two books I read last week, your book and then Batman Catwoman, and we see two like very different Selenas, right? But she seems like such a fun character to write. And I was wondering what is appealing to you about writing her?
Yeah, I mean, to address like the first part of your question, I think people put too much stock into everything has to be uniform throughout. It doesn't. It really doesn't. You can. I think we're all at a point where we're capable of reading two different books and going, well, there's two different takes on a character, and it shouldn't detract from the enjoyment of the character. Like the fact that I love Tim Burton's Batman doesn't prevent me from also loving Chris Nolan's Batman.
Yeah, you're right, right,
Uh,
right. I get it.
yeah. So so that's what I had to say about that part. As far as why Selena is enjoyable, like I'm gonna give you like the least intellectual answer possible.
Okay.
She's just a badass. Like
Yeah.
she's the ultimate badass with, and I said this before. I think she has a moral compass. Like
Mhm.
she has her own ideas of right and wrong, but she's also one of those people who's grown up in a system that's failed her over and over again, and
Mhm.
so her ideas of right and wrong are not the same as the system's ideas of right and wrong. So she's probably more of an anarchist at heart than someone like a Batman who always comes across as a centrist to me, in that
Yes.
he's always trying to pull the extremes to behaving well, and Selena is like, good behavior is overrated.
This is more post Future State. I know that like within Future State, a lot of this Magistrate stuff is very like tied in together. But after the once the ongoing comes back in March, she's with Bruce, right? So how much of that relationship is going to play a part, or will she kind of be on her own and in the ongoing and kind of doing her own thing?
Well, it's a balance, right?
Hmm.
Part of what I really don't enjoy about how the character's been treated over the years is I feel like for a while there with the Brubaker Darwin Cook run, or the Senti run, and bits and pieces here and there, she was a character on her own by her own rights, but invariably always returns to this place where she is still a bat villain, or a bat character, or a bat heroine, or a bat love interest,
Hmm.
and I wanted to sort of go like, okay, we need to give Selena some breathing space where we define who she is and what her stories are like. Um, and I think someone noticed just a couple of weeks ago where they said literally every Selena story I've written has just been a heist. Each time there's a heist, and how long can I keep that going? We'll see, but it sets an expectation that, oh yeah, I'm gonna come to a Catwoman book and I'm gonna see some cool heist stealing stuff. Same
Hmm.
thing. I want to set an expectation. I'm gonna read a Selena book and I'm gonna get this character, and I feel like we've missed out on that partly because the shadow of the bat hangs over her imposingly. Um, but also, you know, she wouldn't exist if it wasn't for her role in Batman.
Right.
And so I think it's a matter of achieving that balance between the two things. And I quite like the push and pull of it, where she's doing her own thing. She very obviously is still in love with Bruce, and Bruce very obviously is still in love with her. Um, and how is that going to weigh against the role that she is taking up here as sort of the next Mama Fortuna in Alley Town, if you will? So I
Right.
think those things are interesting questions, and we'll see them play out in the series.
Yeah, I personally prefer Selena by herself. Like, not to say that not in relation with Bruce, but I love those, like that Brubaker Darwin Cook that you mentioned. I love that run. I think Will Pfeiffer did a run as well that was really awesome. I mean, the Selena's Big Score is probably one of my favorite Catwoman
Yeah,
stories.
and if you look at it, like, it's a
Yeah,
completely independent heist story, you know?
exactly. So, what's your opinion on the Bruce Selena? Like, do you think it serves the characters better to be not in a relationship, or does it not really bother you at all? Like, what's your take
Well,
on it?
I don't approach it in that way. In that I don't have personal sort of leanings towards whether the characters should be in a relationship or shouldn't be in a relationship. And I think this is where I believe that as a writer, you have to put aside your fan hat,
Okay.
because if you're writing and you're writing entirely as a fan, you're always going to be writing the things that you really enjoyed that came before you. You're never going to push the characters into places that are just interesting.
Right.
And I think that relationship is interesting. I think it's very hard for two people who live outside of society's norms to find happiness and live peacefully and happily with each other. Maybe easier if you're a billionaire, but very hard if you're a criminal. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that difficulty in that relationship should be reflected in stories that are written. But equally, we are not human if we don't wish for the things that are the most impossible and most difficult to achieve. So of
Mm-hmm.
course they should be in love with each other, and of course they should be trying to make it work. And I think as a writer, your aim is to create drama, not to resolve it.
Right.
The moment you resolve things, then there is no drama, and you want to create drama. The question is, can you do it with subtlety? Can you do it in a way that doesn't feel ham-handed? And I think that depends on the quality of the writer. You know, um, there's a reason soap operas go on for 400 episodes, and
Yeah.
the same two characters who are trying to get a relationship going in episode 1 are still trying to do the same thing in episode 400.
Yeah. So before we start talking about your DC books, I wanted to know if you could just tease one thing about each series to get people kind of pumped up for the books.
Well, let's start. Let's go in reverse order. With Catwoman, I think people are gonna start seeing what happens when the greater Bat world of Gotham keeps bleeding into the little kingdom that Selena is trying to set up for herself. And I think that's always an interesting scenario to explore. So all the things that she wanted to get away from in Alley Town are slowly finding their way back to her, and so that should get people excited, hopefully. With Justice League Dark, the thing to get people excited is the same thing that excites me. Because these are 10 pagers in the back of the Justice League book, I went to my editors and I said, look, just let me do the wildest, craziest stuff that I can imagine in these stories. Like, let's not put a limitation on, oh well, can we take, is that viable? Nah, I mean, it's 10 pages. Let me do
Yeah.
whatever I can. And so the story is just the wildest thing I've written so far. If you thought the Justice League Dark run as it was leading up to 28 was wild. Like you have no idea how crazy things are going to get. And then as far as teasing the Swamp Thing run, you're going to witness the birth of a character that has been familiar to you, but is also essentially and fundamentally new, and all the things that bodes for the DCU. So the thing that is fundamentally different in how I'm treating Swamp Thing is also that even though it's going to feel familiar to readers of Vertigo and Alan Moore and all of that, I'm doing that thing which Alan Moore did really well, where he tied Swamp Thing into the DCU and he explored the DCU using the lens of this really weird and interesting character. And I think we're going to start doing that again with the series.
Dude, so excited. So excited. I can't wait. I mean, I'm excited for next month, but I'm very excited for March to see all the stuff that's coming out. And then at the top of the episode, I mentioned Blue and Green, your book that came out from Image. I mean, I've seen it in best list. A lot of people are talking about it, but I still think it's gone under the radar with some people. So I was wondering if you could kind of share a little bit about, where that idea for that book came from, because I love music and I love that this book is about jazz. So I was wondering if you could kind of share with all of us what that book is about and the idea behind it.
Yeah, I mean, on the creator-owned stuff, I tend to explore things that are more personally interesting to me. I'm not necessarily trying to put out the next big entertaining blockbuster. I'm more trying to put out, here's an interesting story that I wanted to write. Maybe you'll enjoy it. And so Blue and Green certainly comes from that direction. It comes from my sort of personal obsession with music and jazz. I grew up learning to play 4 different instruments. I still play the guitar, and I have memories of listening to jazz with my dad when I was just a kid, really. And I wanted to touch on and kind of explore this universal question of musicians, artists, writers, all kind of questioning, like, have I suffered enough for my art? Have I really lived life to be able to play pain and joy and love? Like, have I experienced the extremes of those emotions to be able to put that into my work? And I think that's a question a lot of artists, a lot of musicians, a lot of writers, a lot of creative people ask themselves. And I wanted to explore that question through the lens of this kind of magic realist horror, if you will. And so, to put it succinctly, Blue and Green is the story of a middling jazz musician who discovers the photograph of a 60s jazz great in the belongings of his mother who's recently passed away. And then his quest for finding out who that person is and his discovery of the identity of that person leads him down this kind of self-destructive downward spiral, delving into the obsessions of a musician who wants to be successful.
Yeah, dude. I mean, like I said, we get it in the shop and it sells. So I have it on order from Diamond. I'm picking it up as soon as I can get it. You just even made me more excited to read it. So I'm really stoked to finally get a chance to read that book. We talked about all your DC stuff you got coming out. I was wondering if you could share anything else that you're working on, even though I know that's probably keeping you super busy.
Well, I've got another creator-owned announcement coming in today, so stay tuned. And then Vault Comics just announced Radio Apocalypse by me and Anand Radhakrishnan and Aditya Vidikar, the same team that did Blue and Green, same team that did Graffiti's Wall. And it's also another music and comics-based thing. I can talk a little bit about it because the announcement's out.
Yeah, please.
Essentially, it's a story of the last functioning radio station on the planet. So it's a post-apocalyptic world where something's happened, but that's not really the important bit. The important bit is the fact that there's this one settlement called Bakerstown, and they have the last radio station on the planet, and there's just wasteland everywhere else. And the story kind of revolves around the lives of the people who keep this radio station running, and it asks questions of why we are drawn to sharing music even though we don't know who else might be listening, why it's important for us to have music even in the bleakest times where everything feels like it's ending. Surely there are more important things, but no. Music is the reason why people started singing out of their balconies when they were on lockdown. It's the reason why we play music at times of great joy and great sadness. Um, the interesting thing we're doing is each issue is kind of centered around bits and pieces of music, and the comic encourages you to find those pieces of music and put them on while you're reading. Because that's how I write my comics. I put on pieces of music and I write to the music. And I think that's going to be an interesting thing to push into with the comic as well.
So music obviously plays a huge part in your creativity. How are you, like, the music that you're playing? Is it just like instruments, or is it with lyrics as well when you're writing? Because I would feel like the lyrics might kind of be hard. Like for me, like I can't listen to music if, like, let's say I was I wrote something and I'm editing it. Like to me, it's hard for me to write to music if there's like lyrics to it.
If I'm intimately familiar with it, like I've heard All Along the Watchtower so many times now that it could be playing and I could just ignore the lyrics. And of course, I listen to a lot of instrumental ambient stuff. And music in languages where I don't really know what they're saying, so I can totally ignore the lyrics again.
That makes sense.
So, and I listen really widely. Like, I listen to Russian classical composers, and I listen to 60s American jazz, and I listen to Australian bands doing trip hop. I listen to hard, sort of heavy metal. You know, I listen to sort of Nordic death metal. I listen to
all right.
progressive. I listen to Tool. But I tend to focus my playing on blues and like southern psychedelic music. So like
Nice.
Marcus King Band and Cream and all the great sort of blues greats, Arl Bernstein and B.B. King and all those guys. So.
And then, real quick, the last thought on that book, the Vault book, is that a mini series or an ongoing?
Well, it's going to come out in 4-issue installations, and we've talked about 3 4-issue arcs.
Okay.
And so I don't know if it's an ongoing or a maxi series, whatever you want to call it. Okay. But yeah, they're intended to be 3 chunks of story to be told, a trilogy, if you will. But also, I guess the running theme for my creator-owned stuff this year is each issue kind of functions as its own story, and I'm not trying to. Although there is an overarching story. That's not the only structure there. You're kind of looking at individual stories and you're putting the pieces together and you get a sense of what the bigger story is in that.
Okay, cool. Awesome, dude. I'll be on the lookout for that. And before we get out of here, once again, I want to thank you so much for taking time out to chat with me. It's been a pleasure. And if you could share with everyone listening or watching where we can find you online, and I will also drop all those links down below in the comments.
My website, which I rarely ever update, is ram-v.com, but you can subscribe on there and that will put you through into my newsletter list, which this year I hopefully am going to be good about putting out on a regular basis.
Okay.
I'm very active on Twitter, which is the only place that I'm active on social media. So you can find me there at the right Ram as opposed to the wrong one. And I'm on Instagram, but if you're just interested in looking at pictures of my weird sketches and comic book covers that are coming out, then follow me on there. But generally, I tend to be a relatively private person, so I don't really do a lot of personal stuff out on social media. It's all usually work and weird, obscure takes on things.
All right, cool, man. All right. Well, again, thank you, and I would love to do this with you again sometime.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, we could certainly set something up when there's more to talk about.
Awesome, man. All right. Well, thank you so much, and
Thank you for having me, man.
yeah, talk to you soon.